Good evening. I thought for a change I would do day 57 of Bible in 1 year. It's been sitting there a few days, but I've been so busy that and then I thought, yes, I'd like to read the Bible this evening. And so the reading is from day 57, Bible in 1 year. It will be taking longer though. We're way behind, but never mind, it'll continue. So the readings this evening are from Leviticus 11 to 13, Psalm 57, Matthew 27 verses 1 to 26. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The first reading is Leviticus 11, rules concerning the clean and unclean, also clean and unclean animals, and on land. Yahweh God spoke to Moses and Aaron and said to them, "Speak to the Israelites and say, of all animals living on land, these are the creatures you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a cloven hoof divided into 2 parts, and that is a ruminant. The following, which either chew the cud or have a cloven hoof, are the ones you may not eat. You will regard the camel as unclean, because though it is ruminant, it does not have a cloven hoof. You will regard the coney as unclean, because though it is a ruminant, it does not have a cloven hoof. You will regard the hare as unclean, because though it is a ruminant, it does not have a cloven hoof. You will regard the pig as unclean, because though it has a cloven hoof divided into 2 parts, it is not a ruminant. You will not eat the meat of these or touch their dead bodies. You will regard them as unclean. B. In water. Of all that lives in water, these you may eat. Anything that has fins and scales and lives in water, excuse me, whether in sea or river, you may eat. But anything in sea or river that does not have fins and scales, of all the small water creatures and all the living things found there, you will regard as detestable. You will regard them as detestable. You must not eat their meat, and you will regard their carcasses as detestable. Anything that lives in water, but not having fins and scales, you will regard as detestable. C. Birds. Of the birds, these are the ones that you will regard as detestable. They may not be eaten. They are detestable for eating. The tawny vulture, the griffon, the osprey, the kite, the various kinds of buzzard, small kinds of raven, the seagull, the various kinds of hawk, horned owl, night owl, cormorant, barn owl, ibis, pelican, white vulture, stork, the various kinds of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. D. Winged insects. All winged insects moving on 4 feet you will regard as detestable for eating. Of all these winged insects, you may eat only the following: those with the sort of legs above their feet, which enable them to leap over the ground. These are the ones you may eat: the various kinds of migratory locust, the various kinds of Solham locust, Hargol locust, and Hagab locust. But all other winged insects on 4 feet you will regard as detestable for eating. Contact with unclean animals. By the following you will be made unclean. Anyone who touches the carcass of one will be unclean until evening. Anyone who picks up their carcasses must wash his clothing and will be unclean until evening. Animals that have hooves but not cloven, and that are not ruminant, you will regard as unclean. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. Those 4-footed animals which walk on the flat of their paws you will regard as unclean. Anyone who touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening, and anyone who picks up their carcasses must wash his clothing and will be unclean until evening. You will regard them as unclean. E. A small ground animal. Of the small creatures which crawl along the ground, these are the ones which you will regard as unclean: the mole, the rat, the various kinds of lizard, gecko, koa, letea, chamelon, and timshanet. Further rules on contact with things unclean. Of all the small creatures, these are the animals which you must regard as disgusting. Anyone who touches them when they are dead will be unclean until evening. Any object on which one of these creatures falls, when it is dead, becomes unclean. Wooden utensil, clothing, skins, sacking, any utensil whatsoever, it must be immersed in water and will remain unclean until evening. Then it will be clean. If the creature falls into an earthenware vessel, the vessel must be broken. Whatever the vessel contains is unclean. Any edible food will be unclean if the water touches it. Any drinkable liquid will be unclean, no matter what its container. Anything on which the carcass of such a creature may fall will be unclean. Be it oven or stove, it must be destroyed, for they are unclean, and you will regard them as unclean, although springs, wells, and stretches of water will remain clean. Anyone who touches one of their carcasses will be unclean. If one of their carcasses falls on any kind of seed, the seed will remain clean. But if the seed has been moistened and one of their carcasses falls on it, you will regard it as unclean. If one of the animals that you use as food dies, anyone who touches the carcass will be unclean until evening. Anyone who eats any of the carcass must wash his clothing and will remain unclean until evening. Anyone who picks up the carcass must wash his clothing and will remain unclean until evening. The religious aspect. Any creature that swarms on the ground is detestable for eating. It must not be eaten. Anything that moves on its belly, anything that moves on 4 legs or more, in short, all the creatures that swarm on the ground, you will not eat, since they are detestable. Do not make yourselves detestable with all these swarming creatures. Do not defile yourselves with them. Do not be defiled by them. For it is I, Yahweh God, who am your God. You have been sanctified and have become holy, because I am holy. Do not defile yourselves with all these creatures that swarm on the ground. Yes, it is I, Yahweh, who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. You must therefore be holy, because I am holy. Conclusion. Such is the law concerning animals, bird, all living creatures that move in water, and all creatures that swarm on the ground. Its purpose is to distinguish the clean from the unclean, the creatures that may be eaten from those that may not be eaten. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The second reading is from day 57 for Leviticus 12. Purification of a woman after childbirth. Yahweh God spoke to Moses and said, Speak to the Israelites and say, if a woman becomes pregnant and gives birth to a boy, she will be unclean for 7 days, as when in state of pollution due to menstruation. On the 8th day, the child's foreskin must be circumcised, and she will wait for another 33 days for her blood to be purified. She will not touch anything consecrated, nor go to the sanctuary until the time of her purification is over. If she gives birth to a girl, she will be unclean for 2 weeks, as during her monthly periods, and will wait another 66 days for her blood to be purified. When the period of her purification is over, for either boy or girl, she will bring the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting a lamb 1 year old for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or turtle dove as a sacrifice for sin. The priest must offer this before Yahweh God, perform the rite of expiation for her, and she will be purified from her discharge of blood. Such is the law concerning a woman who gives birth to either a boy or a girl. If she cannot afford a lamb, she must take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one for the burnt offering and the other for the sacrifice of sin. The priest will perform the rite of expiation for her, and she will be purified. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Day 57, Bible in 1 year, Leviticus 13. Human skin diseases: A. Swellings, scabs, discolourations. Yahweh God said to Moses and Aaron, if a swelling or scab or spot appears on someone's skin, which could develop into a contagious skin disease, that person must be taken to the priest. Either Aaron or one of his sons, the priest, will examine the disease on the skin. If the hair on the diseased part has turned white, or if the disease bites into the skin, excuse me, the skin disease is contagious, and after examination, the priest will declare the person unclean. But if there is a white spot on the skin, without any visible depression of the skin or whitening of the hair, the priest will isolate the sick person for 7 days. On the 7th day, he will examine the person, and if he observes that the disease persists, though without spreading over the skin, he will isolate the person for a further 7 days and examine him again on the 7th. If he finds that the disease has faded and has not spread over the skin, the priest will declare the person clean. This was merely a scab. Once he has washed his clothing, he will be clean. But if the scab spreads over the skin after the sick person has been examined by the priest and declared clean, then he will let himself be examined again by the priest. After examining him and certifying the spread of the scab over the skin, the priest will declare him unclean. It is a contagious skin disease. B. The cases of dormant skin disease. Someone who has a contagious skin disease must be taken to the priest. The priest will examine the sick person, and if he finds a whitish swelling with whitening of the hair and an ulcer forming on the skin, which is a dormant skin disease, and the priest will declare the person unclean. But if the disease spreads all through the skin, if he covers up the person entirely from head to foot so far as the priest can see, the priest will then examine the sick person, and if he finds that the skin disease covers his whole body, declare the sick person clean, since it has all become white. He is clean, but as soon as an ulcer appears on him, he will be unclean. After examining the ulcer, the priest will declare him unclean. The ulcer is unclean. It is contagious. But if the ulcer becomes white again, the sick person will go to the priest. The priest will examine him, and if he finds that the disease has turned white, he will declare the sick person clean. He is clean. C. Ulcers. When an ulcer appears on someone's skin and then gets better, and if then a white swelling or a reddish white spot forms on the same place, the sick person will show himself to the priest. The priest will then examine him, and if he finds a visible depression in the skin and a whitening of the hair, he will declare the person unclean. This is a case of contagious skin disease breaking out in an ulcer. But if on examination the priest finds neither white hair nor depression of the skin, but a fading of the affected part, he will isolate the person for 7 days. If the disease has then spread over the skin, he will declare the person unclean. This is a case of contagious skin disease, but if the spot has stayed where it was and has not spread, it is the scar of the ulcer, and the priest will declare the person clean. D. Burns. If someone has a burn on the skin and an abscess, a reddish white or white spot forms on the burn, the priest will then examine it. If he finds a whitening of the hair or a visible depression of the mark on the skin, a contagious disease has broken out in the burn. The priest will declare the sick person unclean. There is a contagious skin disease. If, on the other hand, the priest on examination does not find white hair on the mark or depression of the skin, but a fading of the mark, then the priest will isolate the person for 7 days. He will examine the person on the 7th day, and if the disease has spread over the skin, he will declare the sick person unclean. This is a case of contagious skin disease. If the mark has stayed where it was and has not spread over the skin, but has faded instead, it was only a swelling due to the burn. The priest will declare the person clean. It is merely a burn scar. E. Diseases of the scalp and chin. If a man or a woman has a sore on the head or chin, the priest will examine the sore, and if he finds a depression visible in the skin, with the hair on it yellow and thin, he will declare the sick person unclean. This is tinea, Tinea. That is to say, a contagious skin disease of the head or chin. If on examination this case of tinea, the priest finds no visible depression in the skin and no yellow hair, he will isolate the person so affected for 7 days. He will examine the infected part on the 7th day, and if he finds that the tinea has not spread, that the hair on it is not yellow, and that there is no visible depression of the skin, the sick person will shave his hair off, all except the part affected with tinea, and the priest will again isolate him for 7 days. He will examine the infected part on the 7th day, and if he finds that it has not spread over the skin and that there is no visible depression of the skin, the priest will declare the sick person clean. But if after this purification the tinea does spread over the skin, the sick person is unclean, and there is no need to verify whether the hair is yellow. Whereas, if so far as he can see, the tinea is arrested and the dark hair is beginning to grow on it, the sick person is cured. He is clean, and the priest will declare him clean. F. Rash. If spots break out on the skin of a man or woman, and if these spots are white, the priest will examine them. If he finds that the spots are of a dull white, this is a rash that has broken out on the skin. The sick person is clean. G. Loss of hair. If someone loses the hair of the scalp, this is baldness of the scalp, but the person is clean. If he loses hair off the front of his head, this is baldness of the forehead, but the person is clean. If, however, a reddish-white sore appears on scalp or forehead, a contagious skin disease has broken out on the scalp or forehead. The priest will examine it, and if he finds a reddish-white swelling on scalp or forehead, looking like a contagious skin disease, the person has such a disease. He is unclean. The priest will declare him unclean. He has a contagious skin disease of the head. The law concerning cases of contagious skin diseases. Anyone with a contagious skin disease will wear torn clothing and disordered hair, and will cover the upper lip and shout, "Unclean! Unclean!" As long as the disease lasts, such a person will be unclean, and being unclean will live alone and live outside the camp. Infections of clothing. When a piece of clothing is infected with mold, be it woolen or linen clothing, linen or woolen fabric, or covering or leather, or anything made of leather, if the spot on the clothing, leather, fabric, covering or object made of leather is a greenish or reddish colour, it is a disease to be shown to the priest. The priest will examine the infection and isolate the object for 7 days. If on the 7th day he observes that the infection has spread on the clothing, fabric covering, leather or object made of leather, whatever it may be, this is a contagious disease, and the object is unclean. He will burn this clothing, fabric, linen or woolen covering or leather object, whatever it may be, on which the infection has appeared, for this is a contagious disease which must be destroyed by fire. But if on examination the priest finds that the infection has not spread on the clothing, fabric covering or leather object, whatever it may be, he will order the infected object to be washed and will isolate it again for a period of 7 days. After the washing, he will examine the infection, and if he finds that there is no change in its appearance, even though it has not spread, the article is unclean. You will burn it. It is infected through and through. But if on examination the priest finds that the infection has diminished after washing, he will tear it out of the clothing, leather, fabric or covering. But if the infection reappears on the same clothing, fabric, covering or leather object, whatever it may be, this means that the infection is active. You will burn whatever is infected. The clothing, fabric, covering or leather object, whatever it may be, from which the infection disappears after being washed, will be clean after it has been washed a second time. It's making me itch, all this reading about all this. Ugh. Such is the law governing disease in a linen or woolen garment, a fabric or covering or leather object, whatever it may be, when it is a question of declaring them clean or unclean. The word of the Lord. Well, that was pretty long for all of that. So now we still have Psalm 57 and Matthew to read. I don't know if you want me to take a break and then read them separately. That might be a good idea. I could do that. I think I should do that, because this is 34 minutes long. I can't make you sit and listen to Psalm 57 and Matthew as well. It will be too long. God bless you all. If you're listening to all of this, because it's making me I feel like scratching out all my hair. It's so awful, isn't it? Dreadful. Makes you feel all creepy. Yes, I'll stop here and I'll continue afresh. Thank you. God bless.